Bom, boa noite, pessoal. Sejam muito bem-vindos para o webinar internacional denominado Flowers, Bees and Climate Change. Eu sou o professor Gilberto Fisch, da Universidade de Taubaté, e eu serei o moderador desta apresentação. É uma satisfação muito grande apresentá-los, o professor José Fuentes. Ele é professor da Pennsylvania State University, especialista na área de meteorologia e mudanças climáticas. O professor Fuentes e eu tivemos a oportunidade de ministrar um curso nos meses de fevereiro e março deste ano, na Universidade de Taubaté, da forma presencial e online, chamado Climate Change, onde apresentamos os principais conceitos relativos à mudança climática. Quem tiver interesse em assistir essas aulas, foram 5 aulas, pode procurar no YouTube da TV Unitau, porque ela está disponível. Os meses foram final de fevereiro, início do mês de março de 2023. Bom, na oportunidade de hoje, o professor Fuentes vai falar sobre as relações entre abelhas, plantas e mudanças climáticas e como as mudanças climáticas podem estar afetando essas relações. Então, seja muito bem-vindo, você, e a partir de agora o microfone é seu. Welcome, você. And from now on, the floor is yours.
Muito obrigado, Gilberto. Muito obrigado. Boa noite a todos. I am going to speak English, and I will do my best to go very slow so that all of you can understand and follow what I'm saying. So I will speak a little bit about gases that are produced by flowers, what their role is, and how these can actually modify the chemistry or the attributes of the floral scents. And what I hope to do tonight is to explain basically how the degradation of these pollutants actually be transformed by air pollutants that we find close to the atmosphere. Those transformations can lead to changes in the foraging times of the insects, simply because the scents are being modified by the chemical reactions of these gases. And then I will try to explain at the end how processes such as climate change are actually impacting the emission, transport, and chemistry of these scents. We know that in many regions of the world, such as in the United States, the bees are actually increasing of their population. You see in this diagram here that the number of apiaries is basically declining with time. That there are so many stresses that can explain why bee populations around the world are increasing. Those reasons basically include illnesses and some biotic and abiotic stress. And this is happening everywhere in the world. And what we need to keep in mind is that the bees played a very fundamental role in the pollination of plants, particularly crops. And so you see that some of the bees that are really serious trouble because their population is going down are the honeybees that are often used to produce honey, the bumblebees, these are big bees actually, the monarch butterflies, as well as the solitary bees. Those are the principal bees that are basically decreasing in their population around the world. And so when we look, at the various organisms that contribute to the pollination of crops, what we find is that at the global scale, the bees are the ones that do most of the pollination. You can see here at the bottom that we have the bees. They have basically the blue and the red and the yellow with the red color, and those basically signify the global, all the local, regional, and importance. And when you look here in the case of Brazil, right there, most of the crops are actually pollinated by the bees. Therefore, it is really important that we understand what the various stresses are that are contributing to the declines in the population of bees. And there are many, many reasons that we can cite why the bees are actually disappearing in some places. One reason is the reduction in the native habitats of the bees. The other one is habitat fragmentation. But more importantly, the use of pesticides everywhere actually are producing some chronic exposure to compounds such as neonicotinoids. And these compounds actually are the most lethal ones that can actually destroy communities of pollinators. And of course, we have diseases, and we also have now the emerging danger associated with atmospheric warming. So, in a way, we have so many reasons why we can actually think that the bee populations are decreasing. But one very unique stress that has received only limited attention is the indirect impacts of airborne pollutants on the insects. And the reason why this is a stress is because we need to remind ourselves when the bees need to locate flowers, then the flowers use some scents in order to attract the insect pollinators to visit with them. And so flowers produce many and many scents, odors that the insects actually detect through the antenna, and this scents basically exists in the air in only trace amount that only the insects or the bees can actually detect. But these compounds are very, very reactive in the atmosphere. And so the way that plants or flowers communicate with bees is actually through these scents. And therefore, scents play a very fundamental role in pollination. As mentioned, there are thousands of molecules that flowers produce. For instance, we have molecules such as the benzaldehyde, which we call that benzonoid compounds. Then we have limonene, which belongs to the monoterpenes. We have methylbutanol, which is a acid derivative, and we have myrcene, linalool, which are also monoterpenes, and then we have the sesquiterpenes, big molecules that the flowers produce. The key attributes of all these molecules is they have basically double bonds in their chemical structure. And that's exactly why they are very reactive. Now, these sample molecules see here are the ones that are more abundantly produced. But then flowers such as the squash flowers produce some molecules that actually have nitrogen atoms in them. And that's very unique. And then we have flowers such as the lilies or the dead forest arum, but they release these compounds that have sulfur in them. And these are very unique molecules that flowers produce, just mostly to do the interaction in this instance with flies, not necessarily bees, but mostly the flies. And so when we actually want to document how the bees actually are detecting these scents, they are basically navigating. They are traveling throughout the landscape. And as they do, the antenna are detecting all these spikes you see on this diagram here, this diagram is often called the each little spot that you see here represents a given molecule that is in the ambient air. And so bees then actually are trying to learn the address of the flowers by knowing the mixtures of mineral scents that flowers produce. And that's exactly the mechanism that is actually happening in order for the bees to learn in what direction flowers are so they can visit them the pollination of flowers. And then in this diagram that you see here, what I am plotting is that the symbols that are highlighted here in uh, green, basically those are the emissions of the scents that flowers such as the willow are releasing in order to attract the bees. And then on the blue color, you have that the air temperature is actually plotted against the time here, which is during the day. So I am shading here from about 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock local time, the period when you see the maximum air temperature and the maximum emissions. And that really coincides with the time when the bees are visiting most of those flowers. Now, in places such as nearby the city where I live, air pollutants such as ozone basically exist in very unhealthy levels. And on the bottom diagram that you see here, you have the ozone level expressed or levels expressed in parts per million against the time of day. You can see that this blue line here is denoting basically what the Environmental Protection Agency declares as the 8-hour average ozone that is actually going to protect human health. Any value of ozone that exceeds or is greater than the blue line is unhealthy to humans. Therefore, what I am hypothesizing, what I am speculating is that these ozone levels exceed 70 parts per billion will affect in effect destroy the sense that the flowers produce. And those are the studies that I have been doing both through numerical models as well as experiments that I have done. So for today, what we would like to share with you is that I want to report some results from medical studies we have done to investigate how air pollutants modify the floral sense that the insects are actually detected. And also, we want to know how much the strength of the scent plumes are being modified by the pollutants. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the changes in the integrity and the strength of the scents can actually the origin time of the bee. And by origin time, I simply mean that when you have a bee that you see here on the right hand side is basically trying to locate the flower, that that journey that the bees take is what we call the bee foraging trip right there. And so when the flowers are producing these scents, and if they have polluted air masses coming in, then there will be some degradation of this plume, and as a result, the vegetation of the flowers is going to be impacted by the pollutants. And then it's basically what we have in the environment. These scents that you see here, molecules of osimine, marcin, and linalool that you see on the right-hand side, they can react with oxidants or pollutants such as ozone and also with the hydroxyl radical and the nitrite radical. All those reactions will lead to basically the formation of reaction products. Reaction products are the ones that you see here on the right-hand side. Examples of those reaction products include acetone, formaldehyde, or methyl 3,5-hexenonial, and many, many products that are produced. So this is what we try to do to understand how these scents that are produced by the flowers are basically destroyed by the presence of these three constituents in the atmosphere: ozone, hydroxyl radical, OH, nitrate radical, NO3. And so we need to keep in mind that when we study the reactions of these compounds, basically, uh, I'm sorry, the equation didn't show up here. But what I was going to say is that the factors that influence the rates of these reactions are basically the activation energy, basically the air temperature. There is an expression that basically says that the reaction rate is going to depend on the temperature here. All of these reactions that I mentioned a moment ago basically are dependent on the temperature. The higher the temperature, the faster the reactions that will take place in the environment. Conversely, the lower the temperature, the slower the reaction rates that actually will take place. And so now I want to show you an example of the spatial distribution of this molecule that we call marcin that is derived from a model simulation. So on this diagram here on the left-hand side, you see no air pollution present in the model simulations. In the second one, we have the ozone levels are reaching 60 parts per billion. And on the right-hand side, you see that the ozone levels are 100 and 120 parts per billion, similar to the ozone levels that are experienced nearby the city where I live. Then the colors you see here basically provide the ambient levels of those gases in the parts per trillion on a volume basis. That's what PTV means in this case. So this you can tell that pollution basically is reducing the plumes of these things that are produced by the flowers. The flowers are bedded here, and therefore you can see that the more pollutants we have in the environment, then the less distance here downwind of the flowers, that these scents are actually moved away from the source. And if we look at the results, basically express a downwind distance from the flower. And then if we look up in the vertical, in other words, from the surface to about 30 meters, what you can see that when we have no pollution, then the plumes actually can reach 10, 20 meters. But as we increase the levels of pollutants, then these plumes of don't actually reach those altitudes, and at the same time, don't travel much far away from the tower. In fact, when we have the high levels of pollution, like 120 parts per billion of ozone, so these things only move about 200 meters away from the source. That's basically what we have. Another example is the molecule that we call beta cryophyllene, which is a super reactive molecule. You can see here the structure of the molecule. And then in this case, what we can see is that when we have the polluted air masses, the scents of that molecule basically don't travel that much far away from the flowers. In other words, this is a compound that in the presence of the pollutants, it will remain basically simply confined close to the sources. As a result, any bee, any pollinator that is trying to reach or locate the flowers when air masses are polluted, they cannot reach or identify the flowers that produce this compound that you see right here. And so when we look at the vertical distribution of this molecule, it's the same thing. The air pollutants basically are destroying this molecule very close to the flowers. And in fact, when we have a very polluted air mass of 120 parts per billion, we don't really see much this molecule coming away from the flowers. So this is the evidence that we have that in environments that are polluted, then the signals that the flowers produce to advertise to the bees that food is ready, the nectar is ready, the pollen is ready, then this is the evidence that we have to demonstrate that pollutants are basically destroying this flowers produce to the scents. And here is another kind of uh, way to report the information that I showed earlier, except that in this case, I am looking at the molecule marstine, and then I'm using the friction velocity, which is some sort of an estimate of atmospheric turbulence, the friction velocity of 1 versus the value of 0.2. These are typically more or less calm conditions that we find in the environment. Here's where we have plenty of movement of the air parcels in the environment. And what you can see is that when we have the ozone levels of around 20 parts per billion, then these molecules such as marcin can travel easily 1,000 meters. However, when we have polluted air masses, then this molecule basically is rapidly destroyed, and basically only trace amounts of the molecule will reach 1,000 meters, which is basically the distance where most of the nests where the bees live are actually located right there. So similarly, we can look at the beta caryophyllene molecule, and of course, the changes here in the fraction of the molecule as a function of distance is even more. Uh, uh, the pollution is destroying the molecule more rapidly. As a result, this molecule, as shared earlier, it only remains confined very close to where the flowers are. So that's basically what we have. So the second idea that I want to share with you is that uh, the flowers produce numerous molecules. You can see on this figure here the emission of this expressed as a function of the species. Each little bar that you see here represents one scent, one molecule. And we have the petunia flowers, we have the sunflowers, and we have the canola flowers. So this is the mixture of compounds that the flowers actually produce to attract the bees. So when the bees go out to forage for food, they are looking for this mixture of compounds in the environment. What I have done is to run some numerical simulations to learn how the mixture of the canola flour is modified by pollution. And the result that I have is like this. This plot that you see here on the left-hand side basically tells the mixture of the scents that are produced above the flowers. Those mixtures are dominated by the marcin molecule here, by the cyclin molecule, by the limonene molecule, as well as by the farnesene molecules there. So this is what we find at the level where the flowers are. So when we move downwind 100 meters, 400 meters, 800 meters, and 1200 meters, then you can see that fraction of those molecules are changing simply because they are basically reacting as they travel from the flowers to where the bees are. So if we come to the very end and contrast, let's say, this last plot or diagram with the one initial, so the dominant species are basically the alpha pinene, not the marcin molecule here, and you can note that even the marcin molecule is not even present in that mixture of these compounds. So this is the diagram that illustrates that pollution also modifies the mixtures of these scents that the flowers produce. So this is a really, really important result that we really need to document, because this, in fact, is one of the stresses that we are experiencing nowadays in areas where we have plenty of air pollution. And so when we look at the origin time as a function of the ascent detection, so here on the horizontal axis we have the ascent detection, and here we have the origin time, and then we have the no pollution, and then we have the, and so you can tell that by these bars here that we have, for example, zero point 0.5 parts per trillion. Here, we have, for example, point. Yes, I hear the echo as well. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do with the echo. Okay. Okay, I will then proceed. I will proceed. And so when you have, for example, zero point 0.5 here, the average time, the max is the 90 percentile is in the order of 50 minutes that the bees will take to actually detect or locate the fire. But when there is no pollution, it only takes 5 or 10 minutes for the bees to locate the flowers. So this is the evidence that we have to illustrate, yes, the modification of the sense, both in the reduction of the amounts of sense as well as the modification of the mixture, is actually modifying the time that the bees take in order to locate flowers. So these results that you have here are based on numerical studies. However, recently, some colleagues have demonstrated that the bee foraging trip duration for non-polluted conditions versus polluted conditions basically are appreciably different. And so here is for the first time the evidence that in polluted environments, then the bees are taking longer to actually do, locate the flowers and then return to the rest. In this case, pollution is expressed by this red blood here. This is basically the particle concentration that the authors produce. So when we have basically almost no pollution, the levels are below, I would say, 10 micrograms per meter cube. But when we have pollution, we have more than 500 micrograms per meter square. These are very polluted air masses that we have. So here's the evidence to say that in air pollution can impact the flowers. Now, let me also the other anecdote that I have about experiments that we have done with actual bees or insects. So we have gone out to the outdoors to collect bees right here. We can put them in nets, then we put them in vials, and then these are the vials where we have the bees. And in order for us to work with the bees, we have to basically induce some siestas. We have to put them to sleep. Say. And then once they are asleep, we put some restraining harnesses, and then we are adding some a reward in the form of sucrose to the bees. And then what we do is that we actually ask the bees if they actually can recognize the original scents that the flowers produce, or whether they can recognize the modified scents through pollution. So we put the bees in these containers right there, and then I don't know whether you can see here, we see the tongue of the bee or the proboscis, and then the bee basically recognizes the scent. Here is the instruments that we use in order to do those studies. And here is basically the technique that we employ to really ask, in this case, we were using the cucumber beetle, use light tubes to ask the beetles whether they like the polluted air that came from the squash flowers here. So we put the bees in there, and then we actually were trying to ascertain whether the insect went in one branch or the other branch. And Here's the graphical representation of the experiment, in which we basically had the flower here. This is the flower, this wash, and then we had a pump the air out, and the air follow that yellow arrow, and here's the tube. Also, we have the ozone generator, and then we pass that ozone generator into a chemical reactor, and then this is where the scents produced by the flowers were modified, and then the insect basically had the opportunity to go just where we have the unpolluted air or the polluted air. And so here are the results. Here are the results. Here you have the just the air coming from the flower, and then in the other part of the view, we had the air from the flower plus the ozone, and then eventually went to the insect. And on the left-hand side, what we have is the percentage of choices against the ozone levels. So the green represents just the flower, and the blue is for the ozone plus the flower. And so what you can learn from this is that once once the ozone level of 70 parts per billion was reached, then the bees no longer like the scents that were modified by the ozone. And here is the evidence that we have to illustrate that air pollutants such as ozone can actually, in fact, modify the scents that the flowers produce, but more importantly, that the bees actually become confused. In this case, the cucumber beetle became confused and couldn't recognize the air coming from the smell. So in my lab these days, what we are trying to do is to run these experiments in the outdoors. So we are building some instruments, some technologies that are based on radar, and then we put some instruments on the bees, and then we have the radar that is emitted from some energy pulse, and then the bee, the transponder will intercept that signal, and then we get the signal back on the antenna of the radar. We process that signal, and then we display here on the computer the trajectory that the bees are actually following in order to locate the flower. So we have the location of the radar is close to where the hives are, and we can actually detect the distance that the bees are traveling away from their nest. And the idea, here's the experimental setup that we have the radar here in the field. You can see here this photograph here. This is the experimental farm at the university. And then right here is where the bees were coming, they were carrying this transponder. And so we are now able to monitor how these bees are actually moving in the environment. This is really exciting research that will revolutionize the manner in which we study different organisms, how they throughout the environment. And then the last idea that I want to share with you is to remind you what I said a moment ago. One stress is impacting the insect pollinators globally is atmospheric warming. In this year, I'm plotting the temperature anomalies over land, that's the red line, and over the ocean. And of course, you can see that the temperature over land actually can be much higher than the one over the ocean, simply because water has much higher heat capacity than air. But in the last few years, what you have seen in the last decade is basically some very unprecedented warming that is taking place. So this idea of warming is not happening in the same manner everywhere. There are two regions of the world that we need to keep in mind that are warming more rapidly and more intensely than others. One is the Arctic, and the other region is in the tropics, particularly in the Amazonia region. And so in this on this map, what I am plotting is the August 2018 to 2023, this year, and then it's the anomaly of the temperature. In the previous graph, I mentioned, that the temperature has increased in the last 100 years by 1 degree. But if you look at this scale here, in the Amazon, that is reaching anywhere between 3 and 4. So we need to really then pay attention about the impacts of climate and how they can actually modify this interaction between the insects and the flowers. In other words, between the interaction between the pollinators and the crops. And so I want to, in a way, leave you with this idea that we basically can project how the climate is going to behave in the next 100 years or so. And we have here different scenarios that can be followed. And those scenarios depend on how many activities to reduce the emissions can impact the loading of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The situation is that perhaps act together around the world, then warming in the atmosphere will not exceed 1.5 degrees, and therefore we will follow the scenario of 4.5. 4.5 means 4.5 parts per meter square warming that will happen because of the presence of these gases. And here on the right-hand side, you see that there is an impact, various components or compartments of the planet Earth. That's basically what we have. And so I want to kind of summarize these ideas here in the context of the pollinators and the climate change. First and foremost, basically, the emissions are going to be impacted. Emissions right now follow that exponential pattern. And then we are going to have the emissions following this red line here as a function of the day of the season here. But in a warming environment, the emissions will peak, will reach maximum before the bees actually reach a peak right there. Or it could be that we will have emissions that will be terminated by features such as forest fires, biomass burning, or even severe droughts will be there. So this is going to be impacted and it's going to disrupt the production of these things the bees actually need. And more importantly, these changes will produce some asynchronized emissions relating with basically the foraging patterns and the emissions of these. Additionally, the floral scents can be degraded. Instead of having basically this pattern of the abundance of this molecule distance, we're going to have a different trajectory right there. And then finally, the changes in the scent mixtures is going to actually be modified. The molecules that are more reactive will disappear. And so the bees that are trained, they have evolved with different mixtures of compounds are going to be thoroughly confused because they are not really synchronized to detect the new mixtures of these compounds that are emerging. And so I'm going to share with you the idea that this level of research that we have done so far can confirm that air pollutants represent a major stress for the pollinators, simply because air pollutants can modify quantity and quality of the floral scents. And so in polluted air masses, insects increase the foraging time, in other words, the trip that they take from flowers, from their nest to flowers. And that is going to impact the efficiency of the crop pollinators and other functions that the bees actually produce. And so with these ideas, I want to thank you very much. And I would be very glad to answer any comments or questions you may have. Muito obrigado.
Thanks, Jose. Are you listening me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Jose, for this very nice talk, trying to correlate
Yes.
the flowers, bees, and climate change. I have already opened the questions to the audience. We had between 15, 18 persons at the YouTube watching your presentation. Just 1 second, I will speak in Portuguese for most of the students are Brazilians, of course. Pessoal, eu agradeci o professor Fuentes pela muito brilhante apresentação, tentando relacionar abelhas, flores e mudanças climáticas. Eu estou abrindo aqui para o caso de vocês quererem fazer alguma pergunta, pode escrever diretamente no chat, pode ser em inglês ou pode ser em português, para que eu possa fazer para eles. Enquanto vocês pensam um pouco, eu vou fazer uma pergunta para ele em inglês, ok? Você, they are thinking a little bit and trying to prepare a question for you. Let's say you have shown very interesting results, especially trying to correlate the distance of the bees that they fly. But say, of course, you did this experiment in Pennsylvania State, which is a temperate climate. Could you make some comments that how will be the difference for tropical bees, say the bees that we find here in Brazil, because the temperature will be different, moisture, even the wind speed and so on. So could you make some comments on that?
Okay. Yes. That's a really important question for the following reasons. In the tropics, ordinarily we have higher temperatures. The higher the temperature, the faster the reaction between, let's say, ozone and the molecule. So I would therefore predict that these scents probably don't travel much more a greater distance in the tropics than in, let's say, mid-latitudes, simply because the reactions will be a little bit faster. Another key idea to keep in mind is that, and this is why we did studies using the large-scale simulations, that air turbulence topics, when you average it over, the 24-hour period, there are some differences, and the differences in the air turbulence partly explain the dispersion of these compounds in the lower layers of the atmosphere. So there are those these distinctions that are going to be happening there. The other idea that we need to keep in mind is that the bees basically they venture to go out when they know when the largest emissions of the odors, the scents actually happening. So in the tropics, that's going to happen, during the time when we have the maximum air temperature right there. So those ideas need to be actually blended together in order to explain the differences in tropical environments versus the ones in mid-latitude regions.
Oh, very nice. Okay. And well, I guess that there is no questions from the audience. The audience is most for people from agronomy. They enjoy your presentation, but they have no questions. So I guess that they understood everything, because later on, are you in Berkeley, Jose, or are you in?
I am in Berkeley, yes.
Okay, so pessoal, o professor Fuentes está em Berkeley,
Yes,
Califórnia,
I am in Berkeley.
e ele vai viajar ao Brasil para ir visitar Alegrete, onde eu também estarei. Opa, tem uma pergunta aqui. Ok. O Nicolas Fernandes, que é um aluno de ciências ambientais. Nicolas Fernandes is a student from Environmental Science, Master of Science. He asked you, are there any experiment that measures the adaptation level of the bees? Very good question. Boa pergunta, Nicholas. You understand, Jose?
Yes.
You can see it if you go to comentários.
Yeah, I type a comment there.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So can you see the question?
Yeah. Some German scientists actually are, if these can detect.
The question is, are there any experiment that measures the adaptation level of the bees?
Yeah, yeah, there are. Yes, there are, Gilberto. There are. This is really important, very important. The preliminary results are that some insects are able to detect the reactive products, and those are mostly the moth. They actually are able to do that. So there is a little bit of adaptation there on how insects.
Yeah, he just complemented the question, Nicholas. That if you know that are there some kind of bees that is showing a good level of adaptation for the global warming. I mean, if you can see or if there are studies, previous studies showing that some bees they are better in terms of adaptation for a higher temperature climate.
Yeah. 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 So far, the experiments are very limited. Very few people are doing these studies. So this is a topic that requires engagement from a broader community to really understand these processes in more detail.
Yeah, he wrote here generalist bees. I don't know this. Do you know this word? Gen, gener, generalist bees?
No.
Could no, no. Can you explain a little bit better, Nicholas? Você pode explicar um pouco? Ah, generalist.
Yes.
So do you have a generalist bees that?
Yes. The general. Yeah.
Yeah, the idea was if you notice or if someone has noticed or measured that some types or some kinds of bees they are supporting higher temperatures because so far it is well known that the climate change has increased by at least 1 degrees in terms of global weather. Let's say in some parts of of the world, this increase of temperature can be
Yeah.
more than two degrees. Let's say.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are bees that can
Yeah.
be better adapted than the others.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other question? Mais alguma pergunta, pessoal, para o professor Fuentes? Então, eu agradeço a presença de todos. Você, there is no more question.
Okay.
So I acknowledge their presence, and I hope that they learn very nice things about this issue that you have explained. Oh, there is one last question here from Paulo Fonseca, that he's from also environmental science, Master of Science. How climate change impacts bees in Northern Africa and Southern Europe? Do you have an idea?
Yeah. If you forget about scents, the other stresses for bees are actually the heating. most bees actually have a thermal tolerance, which is in the order of 4 to 6 degrees. And so if the air masses are too heated, meaning that if the temperature becomes too high, then the bees normally don't go out to do harvesting. And if they go out, they will most likely die. And we just submitted a study where we did a little bit of our work in the alpine regions of Bogota, Colombia. And so when air masses are heated, bees don't really do well. And so all the bees are actually in the alpine region. They are migrating higher sites simply because they need to cope with thermal stress. So thermal stress is a really lethal problem for the bees, simply because they cannot regulate their mass. They have no mechanism to cope with the thermal stress. So in places where we have one heated air mass after another, the bees are actually declining more rapidly than in other regions.
Yeah, and in the future with new climate, with severe storms and severe extremes.
Yeah.
So not only the bees, but all the population will suffer a lot.
Yeah.
But the bees, of course, they are much more fragile than the human being, for instance.
Yeah.
So, alguma pergunta mais, pessoal? Ou agradecemos ao professor Fuentes? Então, como eu estava comentando, o professor Fuentes está em Berkeley University, que fica na Califórnia, e semana que vem ele virá ao Brasil. Eu vou encontrá-lo na região sul do Brasil, na fronteira com Uruguai e Argentina, onde teremos a oportunidade de ver os pampas, os pampas gaúchos.
Yes,
E quem sabe encontrar apicultores que estão trabalhando com essa questão, e certamente por eles estarem mais ao sul do Brasil, atualmente eles estão sofrendo grandes enchentes, chuvas muito intensas, fortes, e provavelmente vamos dizer, um teor de umidade relativa mais elevada.
Uhum.
Traremos mais informações para vocês depois. So, José, thank you very much again
for
participating in CICTED,
and
I wish you a very nice flight from California to Rio Grande do Sul, and I will meet you in Porto Alegre. Next Monday.
Do you have an extra adapter? Because I left mine in Pennsylvania.
Adapter of?
For the computer.
Okay. We will work on that.
Ok, thank you. Muito obrigado.
Okay.
Tchau.
Bye, pessoal. Muito obrigado pela presença de todos e bom final de semana e bom final de CICTED. Tchau.